Good afternoon. I'm Ed Yohnka. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Policy at the ACLU of Illinois, and I am so pleased to welcome you to this discussion this afternoon. If you want to access live captions for today's event, you can do that easily if you go to the bottom of your screen and click the button that says captions. It will start the live captioning that we have. We're grateful that we have a captioner who is here and joining us for this and appreciate that work. I also want to just say at the top that we really want your questions. So many of you, and I want to thank you, have submitted questions in advance of today. If you have a question during the program, you can feel free to put the question in the chat box, or you can send the question to events@aclu-il.org. That's events, one word, @aclu-il.org. I guess events is always one word. And those questions will all get to us, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as possible. Some bad news and some good news as we start on this. The bad news is that Senator Durbin was called away to some Senate business this afternoon and won't be able to join us. The good news is that Senator Durbin is about to send along his office is about to send along a video to us, which we hope to share with you by the end of the hour. Before we begin, we really want to just take a little bit of a poll from all of you to kind of figure out how you're feeling post-election, whether you are hopeful or relieved or recommitted to the fight or exhausted, conflicted, or disappointed. And I recognize that for many of you, these emotions probably won't be enough. So we're going to ask you this poll question, and if the options that we've given don't capture your feelings, please feel free to go ahead and put in the chat box how you're feeling, or you can email it to us, an expanded answer for that. So if we can go ahead, we'll go ahead and put that poll up and allow folks to make their choices. And I love the all of the above. So as you can see on our poll, recommitted to the fight gets the majority, along with hopeful, as well as relieved. And I think those are all emotions that from an ACLU perspective, we're happy to see. Before we begin, I'd like to do two other things. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we are gathering during Native American Heritage Month. And although this event is taking place virtually, the ACLU offices are located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami tribes. Indigenous people remain part of our struggle for justice and we're happy at this moment for their inclusion. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are gathering during Transgender Awareness Week, which, as many of you will know, is an opportunity to recall all the lives of transgender people, especially transgender women of color, who have been victims of violence this year. So this event this afternoon is the final event in a three-part partnership with the Weinberg Newton Gallery, which is focused on voting and the election. The gallery's exhibition called Anthem remains both online and in the gallery's storefront windows until December 19th. And that exhibition really is an examination of voting rights in the United States through the work of contemporary artists. To begin our program today, we're pleased to be joined by my colleague, ACLU of Illinois Executive Director Colleen Connell, and David Weinberg from the aforementioned Weinberg Newton Gallery. who are going to offer some welcome remarks of their own. So, Colleen, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Ed, and good evening, everyone. And to echo Ed, I really want to thank everyone for taking time to join us for what I am sure will be a great discussion, particularly if each of you participate. I suspect, having looked at the poll results, that many of you, like me, are starting to breathe again, but we're not breathing easy. The continuing tensions around the transition, including refusal to cooperate with President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Did I say that loudly enough? Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. And the purges of personnel key to cyber and voter security, and the last-minute efforts to just push through some really onerous regulations that have a really negative impact on civil rights and civil liberties are, I think, keeping many of us up at night and really alerting us to the rebuilding effort ahead. And so before we launch into talking about that rebuilding effort, I want to express our gratitude at the ACLU to David Weinberg of the Weinberg Newton Gallery for partnering with the ACLU on this really prescient series of the importance of the right to vote and the importance of election protection. And so, David, I'm going to turn it over to you, but really we are so grateful for this partnership and for the opportunity to present many, many ways of looking at these important issues.
Thank you so much, Colleen. So I'm David Weinberg from the Weinberg Newton Gallery. And I also want to welcome everybody this afternoon. It's wonderful having you with us. And I will tell you that it is worth taking a quick look at Anthem, which is our exhibit that's closing December 19th. Go to our website, which is weinbergnewton.com, and you can, as Ed mentioned, you can view the exhibit in two ways. One, through our storefront windows, and secondly, virtually. You know, never before have we put on a social justice exhibit that is more important and more timely than the one that we have done just now. Because, you know, basically, our democracy is at stake, and voting rights have been at stake. And we continue, as we have worked on this exhibit with the ACLU, to have the highest regard for everybody at the ACLU. These people work so tirelessly for all of us. And so once again, Ed and Colleen, thank you for everything that you do. I also want to give a shout out to Kasia Houlihan, who is a co-director of the gallery, who has curated the exhibit. She did a great job. The gallery, as we had to pivot to virtual, I had this fear that we were really going to lose something, because we're used to having hundreds of people come in for opening night of an exhibit, and then having programs and having everybody sort of shoulder to shoulder and in person. And I always worried that as we went virtual, we were going to lose something. But I've really learned that's not the case, particularly when you're talking about voting rights, because we've had the opportunity to reach other states other than Illinois and get our message out to so many different people. So actually that's ended up being a plus. So just a couple words about the gallery for those of you who haven't seen us online or been to the gallery. We are a non-commercial gallery. Our mission is really to start conversations around social justice issues and to promote activism in that regard. We do this by having 4 exhibits a year, and we partner with social justice organizations like the ACLU and many others. And of course, the topics that we cover are very broad. In that regard, we have our next exhibit coming up on January 14th, and it is with Earth Justice. And it is addressing issues of the environment. Earth Justice is a group of lawyers that basically work for the environment and go to court to save our planet. No small challenge there. So I'm hoping everybody will join us for that. And I hope that you find this afternoon very informative. Nice to have everybody with us.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much. I want to, Colleen, you know, as we're opening this up and sort of thinking about this issue of the election and the aftermath, I want to start with really, I guess, the biggest of big picture kinds of questions, which is, you know, what does the change in a federal administration really mean for the ACLU's clients and our issues and interests across the country? Oh, you're on mute, Colleen.
Thanks, Ed. I want to divide that question into 2 parts, and one is sort of our work on the national or federal level, and then our work on the state level. Starting with the federal level, the most, I think, profound and obvious to everyone on the phone is that it's the difference between, you know, beating your head against a brick wall and actually having, we hope, a partner in rebuilding, particularly, you know, such important fundamental rights as the right to vote. You know, the Voting Rights Restoration Act is one thing that I remain hopeful that with a new administration, we can see Congress actually act to solidify voting rights after the Supreme Court's disastrous opinion or decision 5 years ago in the Shelby County matter. I think that we will also see fewer you know, attacks coming out of the federal government on the rights of immigrants and refugees. And I think that, you know, we actually might see some much needed immigration protections placed into law. I'm sure that everybody joins me in feeling just delighted that we could see a restoration of the DACA program. And you know, I know that restoration of DAPA, you know, deferred action for, you know, basically adult arrival, is also under consideration. So I think that there are many issues on which we can see some really positive action to both protect civil rights and civil liberties and expand civil rights and civil liberties coming out of the federal government. And you know, the ACLU Washington Legislative Office will play a key role, I think, in many of those reforms. Moving to the state level, I think that the really essential work that has been ongoing here in Illinois and at ACLU state affiliates across the country will also continue, and really has renewed importance and renewed vigor. And the 2 areas that I really want to single out for just brief identification are the issues of policing reform and criminal legal system reform. Those are areas of reform in which so much of the action is local. You know, and so the opportunity for us to do good and to make those necessary reforms, I think, is again enhanced when we will not have a president who actually applauds white nationalists, who applauds police violence, and who essentially attempted to involve the military in shutting down peaceful protests.
All issues about which the ACLU has taken action over the last 4 years. One of the questions we got in advance, and you touched on this, and I just wanted to see if you could just tease this out just a little bit more. Somebody asked a question about, how one figures out, like, what are the best issues to be handled locally as opposed to federally. And when you think about that from the perspective of the ACLU, how do you sort of conceptualize addressing that, or even just beginning to strategize around that?
So I want to say that the ACLU is an opportunistic organization in the most positive of ways. We really look to expand and protect rights where we find the most significant opportunity to do so. And I think that to go all structural on you, I think that the first thing that we really do is take a look at the issue. And if it's an issue that our constitutional structure or our legal structure by and large commits to the state or the states, we turn our attention there and really try to use our state-based advocacy to protect and expand rights. If, on the other hand, it's an issue that the federal Constitution provides not just the minimum but perhaps the gold standard, or in an area where there is a real need for a nationwide standard, then we really turn our attention to whether there is positive reform that we can move on a federal level. And I just want to touch real briefly on the election issue again. There has long been a sentiment by many voting rights experts that we need some national standards with respect to voting apparatus, even though the Constitution itself really by and large commits elections to the states. And so, that might be an area in which we could really, look to try to get some nationwide standards that make the right to vote more secure.
Yeah. I want to just touch on there's a couple of questions we got in advance. And one last thing I want to talk a little bit about is that I know that you care a lot about, and that I think this election raises an issue about, which is that, there's this movement at the Supreme Court to create these carve-outs for, so-called religious liberty. And I don't mean that I mean that to be a little bit sarcastic, where the religious liberty is used as a reason to discriminate in kind of a general anti-discrimination law. And I wonder, is that an issue we need to tackle at the local? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it. And then is that an issue we need to tackle at a state level, or do you think there are federal solutions we can find?
So I'm extremely worried about that, Ed. And I think that the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court exacerbates all of our concerns about that. Essentially, the Supreme Court, even without Amy Coney Barrett, has been in the process of really turning the First Amendment protections on its head, so that we have moved from a jurisprudence that correctly, in my view, protects the right of every person to believe whatever he or she or they choose to believe. That is the essence of religious liberty. And yet, that same constitutional jurisprudence found it constitutional to impose, to basically uphold, content neutral, generally applicable laws to the entire country, even if that law might have might not be consistent with your religious beliefs. So for example, excuse me, going back decades, one of the first challenges, and it was unsuccessful, to the Social Security Act was a religious liberty objection, in which the plaintiffs contended that their religion required them to provide for the elderly. And that being forced to do so by a law, really was inconsistent with their religious tradition. And the court, basically batted that aside and said, basically, this is a generally applicable law. It's not affecting your personal belief. And we have now gone to the point of, where in the last term, the court once again upheld the belief of certain employers to not provide contraception consistent with the Affordable Care Act if it was violative of that employer's religious beliefs.
I'm going to give you a minute to take a drink and catch yourself, and we're going to ask another poll question of folks, and I just wonder what people think is what they see as the most pressing issue beyond the pandemic for the Biden administration to take on during its first year: police reform, mass incarceration, immigration reform, reproductive rights, LGBTQIA+ rights, voter protection, judicial appointments, or others. And again, you can feel free. Some of the comments in the chat before were really enlightening. If these don't quite line up with your interest, you can add it into there. So go ahead and cast your vote, and we'll keep going in terms of talking about this. Colleen, another question that we got in advance of this, and it fits something I wanted to ask you about anyway. One of the most remarkable things I think we've seen over the last 4 years is a real engagement on the ground by people, in political ways, in other ways, to sort of look at, and to try to change the system, to try to push back against some of the worst initiatives of the Trump administration. I wonder if you think we need that to sustain, even with a change in the presidency, and how you think that looks as we go forward.
In a word, yes. I think that the mass mobilization of literally millions of Americans since the election of 2016, including through the election in 2020, is one of the reasons that we do now have again an opportunity for reform. But as everyone again on the call recognizes, there are structural problems in our constitutional system, including the Electoral College and the fact that my home state of North Dakota, which has 700,000 people, has the same number of senators, too, as do the people in California, and there are nearly 40 million people who live in California. And so that unfairness really is, results in some ways, minority rule, which underscores the need for all of us on this call and everyone within our concentric and expanding circles to really remain engaged in civic activities, including voter education, voter registration, and voter turnout. Because unless all of us participate, the fact that there are more of us than there are of them, and I keep going back to that refrain, will still result in, I think, horribly gerrymandered minority rule. And so we have to stay in the game. And I'm really, again, so grateful for the fact that the ACLU provides so many ways for us to, for people to stay in the game, whether it's volunteering as a cooperating lawyer, whether it's signing up for our action alert, and reaching out when people get a request from us to contact their state legislators or their members of Congress. Our exciting Next Generation Society is bringing an entire new generation of activists into the ACLU family. And please, everybody, you got to keep this up. It is absolutely essential to not continuing to dig deeper the hole that the Trump administration has dug for us, and to really begin building a much more just, fair, and protective of all people's rights society.
So it was not something I planned to ask, but I got to say that I would be negligent as the moderator here if I didn't ask you the question, which I think has come through the most often, and I'm gonna just select one that I think is particularly illustrative of what I've heard, which is that if President Trump continues to refuse to recognize the validity of President-elect Biden's election through the inauguration day, what agency of government is responsible for his removal from the White House? And is there a legal remedy if that agency refuses to act? I want to stipulate for the record, it is not your personal responsibility to go remove him. Is that right?
I think I'm just going to reference the conversation among us before the call technically started. I think we have many volunteers who would go and help pack, and I think it's really likely the civil services obligation, which will be to the new president, President Biden, to actually make sure that President Biden is allowed access to the White House. And I want to just briefly touch on a question that I think a number of people have raised in the chat box, and also on some of the questions before. There is actually a federal law governing transitions from one president to the president-elect, and that law has basically been around for, I think, some 30 years, and that's never been an issue before. My guess is that even though the Trump administration currently is not providing any transitional assistance, once the date has come and gone for the Electoral College to meet, any even plausible legal argument that the Trump administration could have made will evaporate. And if the General Services Administration, the GSA, does not cooperate, I imagine that there would be a lawsuit.
And then let me just, as we kind of close out this segment for just the two of us, let me just ask, from the ACLU's point of view, these lawsuits that are being played out in places across the country, especially in some of the closer states in terms of the election, does the ACLU really see any merit to those thus far in terms of any of the issues that are being raised?
No, we do not. And none of the judges, state or federal, have found much credence in them. And I will say that, based on some of the articles that I'm sure many of us have read, the judges have been explicitly critical of the weakness of the arguments and the absolute lack of evidence that has been presented in these cases. And what we really have seen consistently is a whittling down of the claims, not just from the grandiose press releases of the lawyers and the tweets of President Trump, but from the actual initial pleadings themselves. We see a whittling down until there's really, quite frankly, nothing left. And many of these cases have been voluntarily dismissed and not pursued.
And just a quick, before I'm going to bring our colleagues in, if in fact one of these suits really took hold and there was a challenge, would the ACLU be part of a legal challenge there, either as an amicus or to try to intervene on behalf of voters?
I think it depends on the specifics, but the answer is in many instances, yes. The ACLU filed some 30-some cases prior to the election for election protection. We were doing that on behalf of voters in those various states. And those same voters basically provide standing to challenge in many instances the kind of claims that the Trump administration, or that, not the Trump administration, the Trump campaign has really been trying to press in court. So, I think that the ACLU would very much try to stay involved. But again, it depends on the specifics.
Yeah, somehow, Colleen, even without Senator Durbin, we managed to fill up all the time we had, even for that part of the segment. So I'm going to invite now our two colleagues, Nusrat Choudhury, our legal director at the ACLU of Illinois, and Khadine Bennett, who's our advocacy director, to join us. Thank you guys for being here this afternoon. Nusrat, I want to start with you. So I think probably everybody who's on this call has seen this stat. It may be because I've announced it a few times already, that the ACLU filed more than 400 legal actions during the course of the past 4 years against the federal government in one way, shape, or form. So as we look beyond kind of just these issues, sort of what do you see as the big opportunities or areas for us to serve clients and to advance civil liberties in federal courts?
Well, I think to build off your prompt there, of those 400 lawsuits, there are also 195 lawsuits to enforce civil rights and civil liberties against the unprecedented threats posed by the coronavirus pandemic, which we are in the middle of, and does not look like it's going away. To the contrary, it looks like it's getting a huge surge and uptick. So those cases, a lot of them remain ongoing, because a number of the cases that we brought against the Trump administration had to do with the building blocks of our democracy. Things like voting rights and so many pillars of democracy, transparency and fairness, that don't just get undone when President Biden takes the oath of office. And I think our work here in Illinois in particular really needs to focus and lean in on three main areas: on reproductive justice, on ensuring the dignity of LGBTQ people, and racial justice. And in all three of those areas, we have already strategic litigation, advocacy with our colleagues across the ACLU of Illinois, as well as areas that we can see coming down the pipe where we need to build and grow. And just to give a couple of examples of what that looks like, this affiliate and partner organizations were critical in ensuring the passage of a landmark Reproductive Health Act. But now comes the hard work of ensuring that those rights that we fought for in the legislature actually are implemented every day, in ensuring rights to reproductive health care for young people, people of color, other marginalized groups, and actually making it real on the ground. And similarly, for LGBTQ people, we have great protections in Illinois, far more than others in other states, but we still need to be active in litigation, ensuring that people have access to trans-related health care in state prison, in federal prison in Illinois, as well as the rights of trans people to be themselves in schools and workplaces. And in racial justice, there could be no other area where there is such intense focus in making sure that we start dismantling and doing more to take apart the structures that promote racial injustice in policing, in the criminal legal system, in the foster system, and in the ways in which those systems intersect with the economy. Because what we see in all those systems is that low income and poor people of color are getting the short end of the stick, whether they're kids in foster care, whether they're people in prisons who can't get health care, whether they're people being targeted for traffic tickets they can't pay, and then are finding themselves funneled into cycles of debt and unemployment and poverty from which they can't get free. And so all of those remain challenges, whether there's a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House. And those are areas where we're going to lean into and fight.
So I got to do a quick follow-up because you raised it, and it was a question we got in advance around reproductive justice and access to reproductive health care. There was a question that came in advance as to whether or not the new Illinois law would sustain a challenge if Roe were to fall. Do you have a view on that?
Our law is not affected by Roe because the people of Illinois have elected legislators who passed a bill that makes it a fundamental right to access abortion care in the state. And so that law guards against infringements of that right. So if a doctor is refusing care for some reason, potentially on the basis of a religious viewpoint, there are protections in place to make sure that that healthcare still is provided. So we don't see a decision in the Supreme Court on Roe impacting the Reproductive Health Act here in Illinois. And it really underscores why it's so important that the ACLU is a national entity with these strong state affiliates everywhere, because we can keep advancing the law here in Illinois in ways that provide a beacon to other states and even the federal government.
So, Khadine, we've talked a lot at the federal level and sort of what's happening there. If we kind of pull this back and look at Springfield, for example, how do you think, are you able to really discern yet how the election really affected the environment for civil liberties and to advance civil liberties in the years ahead?
Thanks, Ted. So not drastically in terms of party makeup, but there will definitely be a lot of new faces come 2021. Going into the election, both the House and the Senate had a Democratic supermajority, and that's still the case after the election. In the House, both parties lost and gained seats. So in the end, the Republicans had a net gain of 1 seat, but the Dems are still the majority. In the Senate, there was just 1 seat change, which resulted in the replacement of an anti-choice Republican with a pro-choice Democrat. In both chambers, there were a number of legislators who chose not to run again. But while there are no party changes in those cases, we did lose some legislators who were leaders in our child welfare, criminal legal system, privacy, and LGBTQ work. That said, we're really looking forward to 18 new House members and 5 new senators in 2021 and building a new civil liberty group of leaders. Though with COVID, it's unclear if I will be back at my home away from home in Springfield or if we'll be doing all of this remotely.
Your home right there at the rail, I'm sure, is longing to see you back there and part of that action. So, and this is really for all of you, but maybe Colleen, let me start with you. So one of the noteworthy results of this election in Illinois really came in the ballot issue, the constitutional amendment that would convert Illinois' tax system from a flat tax to a graduated income tax. It was defeated with around 55% of the voters voting no. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the defeat of that measure might affect civil liberties, because I think sometimes we don't see the link there, but it'd be just interesting to kind of sketch that out a little bit.
Still muted, Colleen.
Still muted. Yep. Thank you, Khadine.
You would think I would have figured this out by now, but and very briefly, the ACLU has a number of cases that we have settled against the state of Illinois seeking to reform various state systems or institutions, including the Department of Corrections, the Department of Juvenile Justice, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, to name 3. And an underlying problem in all of those systems has been chronic underfunding, which has resulted in conditions of care, including medical care or lack thereof, bad educational services that fall below the constitutional standard. And so these consent decrees, which came about as the state settled lawsuits that the ACLU brought, really required the state to provide more funding of these key services in order for those services to meet constitutional standards. If funding is cut to those agencies, it will raise serious questions about whether those agencies will be able to continue to comply with the obligations with respect to standard of care that are set by these consent decrees and which reflect constitutional requirements. And so that's just one area where the failure of the Fair Tax Act to pass could have a dramatic impact on the civil rights and civil liberties of literally tens of thousands of people. There are 40-some thousand people in the Department of Corrections. There are 16,000 children in the care or custody of the Department of Children and Family Services. And so just putting it out there. But I really would love to have Khadine share her thoughts on other areas in which the failure of the Fair Tax Act to pass will impact civil liberties.
I mean, I think, Colleen, you really hit on them. I think we're really concerned about the impact on our consent decrees. We're concerned, even as we think about our own reforms to the criminal legal system, our reforms to policing. Lack of a budget is going to be a huge thing, but it also offers an opportunity for us to rethink what we fund and how we fund. But I think you hit a lot of those things. And I can imagine my colleague Nora, who will be busy fighting budget fights to make sure that our folks are protected, especially the folks who are super vulnerable by virtue of being in an ideal Department of Corrections facility, a juvenile facility, being in a nursing home, and we are so concerned about warehousing. So yeah.
If I can just add to that too, like another thing we're worried about is as the city and the state lack funding, like where are they going to turn to for money? And are they going to be turning to people in the criminal legal system by imposing fines and fees that folks can't pay, which is what we've seen in other states and in Illinois historically. And it's something that we're on the alert to look at. And it's clearly going to be impacted by this failure of the Fair Tax Amendment to pass.
So I want to just stay on the state level for just a moment and turn back to you, Khadine. And I wonder if you could talk about, and I realize that these issues of budget and where that goes are going to affect a lot of this work, but what do you see as the ACLU priorities in Springfield and on the state level for 2021?
I think if our 2021 priorities were a bumper sticker, a long bumper sticker, it would likely say making broken systems less destructive and repealing harmful laws. So I'm going to share 3 of those priorities that fall into those buckets. The first deals with the criminal legal system, specifically our push for comprehensive sentencing reform. And if you've been following us for a while, you know that this has been a long-term priority for our organization. So what does that mean? That includes legislative change that would reduce minimum sentences and eliminate mandatory minimums. It would include things that would downgrade penalties for drug and property offenses, reduce the amount of time people spend in the Department of Corrections. We know that people who are in those systems suffer huge harm, huge trauma, and we want the reforms we're seeking to apply retroactively. That's a pretty important component. The other area is around tackling of the policing system. So we believe that people in all communities should be able to live their lives with the belief that police officers will protect them against violence, not perpetrate violence against them. So some of the areas that we're focused in on would be legislation and policy measures that would increase accountability. So we want to end special treatment for police officers who break the law. We want to hold on-duty police officers accountable when they violate a person's constitutional rights, including violations of use of force policies or failure to intervene when those rights are violated. And we feel like that's a pretty basic thing that should exist. We also want to change policies, including policies that significantly reduce the unnecessary or excessive use of force by police officers. So that would include a statewide standard that emphasizes de-escalation, provides clear limits on use of force, including banning force that limits a person's ability to breathe, and banning law enforcement use of tear gas and rubber bullets during protests and crowd control like we saw over the summer throughout parts of the state. We want to demilitarize police. So we want to drastically limit law enforcement's use of military and surveillance technology and tactics. So that includes banning police departments from using weapons of war and surveillance equipment. We also want to reduce unnecessary interactions between law enforcement and members of the public. So what does that mean? It means banning the use of school resource officers. And we also want increased investment in communities. Understanding there's a budget crisis in place, I think there are ways that we could rethink how we prioritize resources so that we're able to invest in alternatives to policing in schools and in response to individuals who are experiencing mental or behavioral health crises. And we will also continue our work to repeal the dangerous parental notice of abortion law in Illinois. And in addition to those things, we will always continue to fight against attempts to restrict our civil liberties.
So kind of a short list, basically.
Super easy, not a big deal, you know. If only.
It's the ambition of it that's moving. Hey, we're sort of into our last, 10, 12 minutes. And one of the things that came up a lot in the pre-questions, and I've got some other questions I want to get to, but Nusrat, I don't want to let this go, is a lot of people asked about, what happens now around immigration policy. Colleen mentioned this a little earlier, and I'm certain that Senator Durbin would have highlighted the harm that's been done to people by the immigration policies of the last 4 years. So I just want to just sort of set, if you have a little bit of a sense of sort of looking forward of the ACLU's views about, what happens and how that impacts newcomers and asylum seekers.
Well, there are some immigration policies that we hope are gone on day one of a Biden administration. But there are a lot of policies that are going to take a lot of work by the ACLU and partners to undo and unpack. And then there's existing immigration work that we always have to do, again, no matter who is in the White House. So to start from the top, the kinds of things we hope are going to just disappear on day one are things like the remaining Muslim ban, which was enacted through an executive order. The executive order trying to use funds that Congress had barred from going to the construction of a border wall, which President Trump then tried to put towards that wall, and which the ACLU has effectively blocked in court. But the Trump administration could try to seek appeals, but that would hopefully be done on day one. But then we're sitting here living in a country where there are hundreds of families that remain separated, some of whom the government entirely lost track of, both during the zero tolerance policy and before during a pilot program. And as many have been probably following, the ACLU has been pushing for the reunification of these families through our litigation, but it's hard work. And the Trump administration did not make that easy. And so there's going to be ongoing work, I think, even into a Biden administration to try to connect those families back together through some really huge hurdles. And then in places like Illinois, we have lawsuits challenging state and local law enforcement who have engaged in profiling in conjunction with federal law enforcement. Those suits aren't going away because the legal principles they stand for, the protections of people of color and immigrants they stand for, remain important. And that includes doing things like enforcing Illinois' Trust Act, which gives state and local law enforcement the power and the right to be able to release people from detention when they no longer have legal authority to keep them there, rather than turning them over to ICE to do what they will with them. So I believe that work remains important and evergreen here in Illinois to make sure that immigrant communities are protected.
So one of the questions we got during the course of the hour, and I just want to raise, so Illinois has made a number of changes to make the voting process here easier and more accessible. But there are other things around the electoral process that people have proposed, and both at the federal level, talking about ending the electoral college, to the local level, with less money in campaigns and things like that. I wonder if any of you who want to jump in, I see Colleen leaning in, wants to kind of try to tackle this in terms of what you see as other steps that we might take or should be taking or thinking about here in Illinois.
I'm going to pass. Let's. I'd love to hear Khadine and Nusrat's views on this.
I guess I would start with implementing the laws that we have on the books. So making sure that they are actually, one, people know they exist, and two, that they actually work for the people they were meant to serve. So I think those are the two big things that come to mind. We've spent a lot of time leading up to the election doing work, educating folks with records and folks who work with them to let them know that they have a right to vote after they leave prison and jail. And it's been fascinating to see, as we're putting up posters, so many people still don't know. And I think, a right isn't real until people actually know about it and they're able to actively engage in a way that doesn't, if you try to register to vote and it doesn't work, then you're unlikely to go back again. So I think the implementation and education is pretty important.
Nusrat, you want to take
hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. And it's really interesting when you think about that, is this underscores so much, is that idea that the right doesn't matter if people don't know about it and know how to exercise it, which I think becomes important. one of the other questions we got in advance, and this is one I just love to hear all of your thoughts about. I think I could probably guess some of them, but what do you see as the biggest constraints to civil liberties here in the state of Illinois? What are the things that you think animate that process of constraining basic rights for people? I've asked a stumper. This is great.
So I'll start. I'm a litigator, and I believe that we can win, even when the courts are conservative and, you know, they're appointed by folks who don't share our civil rights and civil liberties values. But we do have a federal judiciary that is now significantly more conservative than it has been. I think basically in the past 100 years, we are looking at a level of conservatism that we haven't seen since the Progressive Era and the New Deal. That said, and you know, this was not a surprise. This happened because the current occupant of the White House appointed about 300 federal judges over the last few years. And I think that we just have to be creative as litigators, as advocates, and working with our partners in making those arguments where we get unlikely allies even in the courts. And we've done this in the past. We won some of our most historic decisions on sex discrimination and equality, even LGBTQ rights with conservative votes. And I think we just have to keep being creative and making that happen in our litigation.
Khadine, you want to try that one?
Yeah, so because I work in the legislature, the thing that comes to mind for me is we need people to tell their elected officials that they care about the issues that we're working on. We need people to, if you care about us, care about people in Illinois, call, text, write, send a postcard to your legislator to tell them that you care about reforming the criminal legal system, that policing is still important to you, even though it's not this summer at the height of people's awareness of what was happening to so many people, that you really support repeal of P&A. Because what we're hearing right now from some legislators is, do people actually want us to take this action? Is that really a priority for folks? So I would say the biggest issue is if folks aren't engaged and they're not willing to take that additional step. It's really important now, especially since we may not be in Springfield and using our tools in the traditional ways. We're really relying on people to take action and doing it every day. So, you know, whatever issue you care about from the ACLU, every day you can talk about a different issue. So I would say people need to contact their folks.
You know, I think the one thing we've seen over the last 4 years, just kind of picking up, is the indivisible model and others of simply calling your legislator's office once a week about something is just an amazing sort of model to think about, just to know I'm going to be here and I'm going to keep saying this. Colleen, I want to give you a chance at this question, but I want to add, if I could, to your question, is not what are the biggest constraints, but are those constraints different depending on where one lives in the state?
Yes, I think they are. But I would frame another aspect or another impediment. I think the demise of civic education, and as a consequence, civic virtue, is a real impediment to reform. I think that the polls that we've all seen that show not just an alarming lack of public support for, you know, certain individual rights, but also an alarming public approval of autocratic actions, particularly executive actions that are completely at odds with the constitutional system of checks and balances that were created because the framers recognized the corrupting aspects of power, and recognized that unless there were checks on governmental power imposed in the Constitution itself, these fundamental rights would not be safe. And so I think that, you know, we really, in addition to engaging all of us, and I'm not worried that everybody on the call is knowledgeable about the rights and the need to protect them. But unless we actually, and maybe bubble is the appropriate term to use in this pandemic era, unless we actually are able to jumpstart the kind of civic education and the kind of civic virtue that leads to a much broader sharing of these democratic with a small d principles, I think that we are going to continually, be operating at best on razor thin margins that will be a real impediment to the kinds of significant structural and other types of reforms we need in all of our governmental systems. And just because, we haven't mentioned enough impediments, I think this country really, in exploring those constitutional and civic values that we hold dear, really has to grapple with the issue of race in this country and the ways in which our constitutional structures not only created but perpetuated the racial caste system, starting with slavery and including our treatment of indigenous peoples, but how the Supreme Court's absolutely churlishly narrow reading of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments enacting or basically empowering clauses, and the way the court has narrowed oftentimes the kind of civil rights and civil liberties legislation that we saw after the Civil War, and that we've seen in some of the Rehnquist and now Robert courts narrowing of the effects of the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 means that our system of law, of constitutional laws, is really continuing to oppress people of color in this country. And I think we really need to grapple with that.
Let me first of all, let me thank all of you. Before we go, we're going to do one last poll question. Just to ask folks generally what civil liberties issue is most important to them: police reform, mass incarceration, immigration reform, reproductive rights, LGBTQIA+ rights, privacy rights, and freedom from surveillance, and First Amendment rights. And as we are getting the votes from there, Colleen, I just want to turn back to you for a little close to send us out on. I would just say your mention of civic education moved me. I don't know if you guys saw this story. Literally, we elected a United States Senator 2 weeks ago who doesn't know the 3 branches of government. We've got a lot of work to do.
Oh my God, who is that?
Khadine.
Before you hop on to Colleen, I just want to give a shout out to People Power, and that's a tool that we have at the ACLU. So if you're interested in taking action, if you're interested in figuring out what's the first step, sign up for People Power and follow ACLU on all of our platforms.
Great. Colleen.
So we're at the hour, and I just really want to thank everyone on this call, including our colleagues who helped do the tech behind the scenes, including sending out all the invites, but really to end on the note that the work that we do at the ACLU would absolutely not be possible without the support of each of you. And that support comes in a myriad of different ways. And we are grateful for it. And the country needs a strong ACLU and a very, very, very strong ACLU membership. So thank you. And I'm going to hope that everybody will be back with us next year for what is looking like at least a winter and spring of virtual events. We're going to keep them coming as long as you keep coming. So thanks again, and stay safe.
And one last thing, and I'm sorry, but I just got this note. We never were able to fix the technology to get the video from Senator Durbin. He asked me again to just express his regret that he couldn't be here. We'll get him back for another one in the future. Thank you all very much.